So, Councilman Winston from Charlotte, North Carolina, we welcome you to the Regional Housing Forum. I've been looking forward to this conversation and looking forward to learning a lot about how you've brought about some of the change that we like to think about here in Atlanta, how you've done that in Charlotte. What a great job you've done there. And I know it's not just you, it's a whole team of people. And from reading the articles, it really was a campaign to try to get away from the scare tactics and away from the fear of change. But I really appreciate you taking time to be with us. Can you tell us kind of how this change came about? Was it community-led or council-led? Was it kind of bubbled up from the community? And how you came to seek residential zoning reform in Charlotte? If you could just speak to that to begin with.
As well, first off, it's always good to take a virtual trip down 85. I think the traffic is a little less of a problem. This will only be second to that high-speed rail that we can make happen to connect our two cities, hopefully in the next within the next generation. But to answer your question, this housing conversation really did come out, and in specific, our comprehensive plans, this elimination of single-family exclusionary zoning really did come out of a community conversation that has been happening for a longer period in time. It culminated in 2016 after Keith Lamont Scott was killed by Charlotte-Mecklenburg police, and we had an uprising of people in Charlotte, and this was, I think, one of the first times that a lot of the different silos of our community really came together to say that there's something wrong here. I started going and paying attention to a bunch of different conversations that were happening, whether they were in government, whether they were in the faith community, whether they were just on the streets, of people knowing that there was something wrong here, there's something great here in Charlotte happening. But every time this city gets greater, we take next steps. Some of us seem to fall further and further behind. Later in 2017, in the spring of 2017, we had an entity called the Leading on Opportunity Task Force put out a report that was based on the Chetty study, which named us the worst major metropolitan city in America for upward economic mobility.
And that study came out of Harvard, am I right?
Yes, yeah. That study came out of Harvard and I believe Berkeley. And one thing that Charlotte does, I think, as we do try to get out the shadow of Atlanta, is we take very seriously when our image is nicked. And that really was a big nick to say that we are the worst at something, despite all of our wealth, all of the beautiful, shiny things that we build. But that report, I think, really gave, provided a vernacular, right? These were things that we were feeling. That is why you had that uprising in the street. We knew that things were happening, but we didn't have the necessary language, to connect those dots. And that report really did connect the dots, and it didn't say what entities had to do, but it gave suggestions. And one of the biggest suggestions for the city, the municipal side of things, was that the way we build neighborhoods, the ability to have affordable housing, and affordable meaning, and not just to pay rent, but it's something we were talking about before this, the ability to get food, the ability to pay for utilities, that there are structural policies that have been built and layered upon generations that have created this. And in order to solve that issue, we have to rethink, reimagine, deconstruct those layers of policy, and build more equitable ones. And so when I and we were elected in 2017, we ran with that language. and we say, hey, we're not going to just keep studying this. There's something that we can do. We were in the middle of a unified development ordinance process, but we also saw that, hey, just doing that is, making regulations, making a toolbox is no good if you don't have a blueprint for where you want to go.
So one of the things that we've done at the Housing Forum is not always talk about housing. We might talk about transportation choices, our schools, our health, public health, just as you're saying, to connect the dots. Mm-hmm. So if I understand it, you had a task force that really came back that was helpful to pivot off of. And that really came out of considering a new strategic plan. I know I read articles that your plan was out of date by about 40 years. We struggle with the same thing in Atlanta, but I think it's important for us to understand, the sequence. We look at a new strategic plan. How are we going to plan the city going forward? We're both growing like crazy. Then a task force to really focus on the issue gave you in a study that you could pivot off of. Is that correct?
That's very correct. And again, we were while this was all going on, we were still working on this unified development ordinance. Right. So if you have a UDO, but that you don't change, like I said, the blueprint, then you just have a better tools to do what you've been doing all along better. And if you don't really define, but then if you make those changes, if you don't define what those changes are, you can change to something that it won't. We can make changes, right, but that doesn't mean we're making the changes that get to a more equitable society. So
the phrase we often use here is "getting beyond ain't it awful," And so, what do we want to do, right?
Well, that's so important. So, what the comprehensive plan is, and it's important to know what it is a policy guiding document. So, but when we had to define, we had to create our North Star, right? Our direction, our goal of where we want to get to. And so we went into an engagement through a wide community engagement process over 2 years to ask that question. What do we want to change to? Ultimately,
and you went to neighborhood meetings and business council meetings.
We went to everything. I mean, we went to, like I said, faith communities. We went to community meetings. We went to schools, our CMS schools. We went to, to talk to young people. We went to other government entities. We tried to find any way that we can reach out to populations within our city that needed to be represented, that weren't represented. We came up with an equitable growth framework that is able to measure equity or lack thereof. This was something that the community had to tell us that is what they wanted, that they wanted an equitable society. And Charlotte,
when you say we, who is the we that went out? Was it a team of people? Was it city folks?
Our planning department, our city planning department was the lead kind of organizer of this. But through first in 28, right after 2017, and we get to 2018, we hired a planning director. Our planning director position was vacant for almost 3 years at that point in time. And we hired a planning director whose kind of skill set was around building these comprehensive plans. And so when Mr. Jaoba came in, he really, we brought other consultants in as well to find, hey, how can we go out and engage people in ways around land use policies? Like, who knows about land use policies? Right. But do it in a way that engages folks. So we made many different things. For instance, we created a board game where people can decide different growth strategies, put them on different places of the map and see how those situations work out over time. While we had a hard board game, we even created a virtual board game so folks can do it on their smartphones. But that's just, again, one example of the different types of engagement.
So many different tools are needed. And if I'm hearing you correct, language is very important.
Oh,
how you frame.
Oh, absolutely. Not just language, though. I think one of the most important things, and this is something I've been learning over the past 4 years that I've been in office, you need the data, right? You need the data to inform that language, and the way you match the data and visualize that data, because that is really what we do as a government, right? We are a repository of information. So how do we visualize and communicate that data in ways and empower our citizens, our constituents, to utilize and visualize that data and language to clearly communicate, again, future policies over these next generations that, again, will hopefully achieve our ability to get to that North Star. If this comprehensive plan is like our North Star, now we know where we want to go, but we need a map, right? We have to map what the future of the city needs to look like to get there. So the next step that we're going to do is create our place type maps. Our place types will correspond with zoning districts, which will be codified in our UDO. And then when you have those place types and zoning, the massive rezoning of our entire city, that's where you have your map, but then you have to chart the course. Where are the other investments? Where are our capital investments? Where do they go along with the rezoning of an entire city? And where are our economic development dollars going to go? And then, of course, when we map that out and we chart a course, we're going to go along the course and we're going to learn from the wins and the losses and adjust as we go. And again, that is really what the comprehensive plan lets us do. We can go back and say, okay, that policy didn't necessarily work here. Here's another option that we can go to. We have a menu of a guiding document that can help us over the next generation. That's an amazing thing.
In bringing other council members along, because they represent their own constituency, and knowing that the framing and the language is so important, what were the winning arguments? I mean, I know you didn't convince everyone, but you're in a process. Was it around win-win for the different constituencies, or we're going to make a more equitable community? I mean, how did you bring folks along to support this?
So the number one thing was getting people smart about what this was versus what this wasn't, and getting them comfortable with plugging themselves into the process. Ultimately,
so let me ask you a loaded question here. Were you able to get the chamber to realize that a more equitable city is a better sell for business?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, absolutely. So you did have some strange bedfellows here. You did have, Democrats and Republicans on both sides of this thing. You had businesses on both sides of these things. You had even folks from the real estate industries on both sides of these things. I think ultimately what the balance was, we had to decide that, whether we're going to stick with the status quo or we're going to, or being convinced that we have to go somewhere different. We have to realize in government in America, wherever we are in, is that even when we see a wrong, if something that we think is wrong, there's parts of our population that don't. Sure. And I won't even say that's not a good or bad thing. It's just a thing. It's your purview. It's the way, your lens sees things. For instance, because there has been this missing middle housing, there are certain business models that have thrived over time, developers, right, real estate folks. And, you understand the concerns from the perspective of all of a sudden the business landscape is going to change, Right. That's when you have more competition or different types of competition, all of a sudden that does affect business models. And you understand. That's why it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but ultimately we were able to convince more people that is for the good of Charlotte, for the good of North Carolina, for the good of America. We have to change the way we are approaching dealing with growth in our city. And we don't have, and we can't stop growth. People are going to keep having babies. People are going to want to keep coming here.
Exactly. if you were giving advice to all the folks listening today, and there could be hundreds of them, a broad cross section of the community, what are just some core things you tell folks?
Well, we got to understand what our job is, each of us, and before we can intersect in our work, we really have to understand where we're at. It is the job of Charlotte City Council in a council manager form of government, which I think is different than Atlanta, which has a strong mayor, to really work on the high level policy guiding documents. And we can lead in that regard, but we can't, again, lead when it comes to business model formation. But we need, for instance, the chamber
Right.
to really understand their role and how it interacts with what we're saying. We need the labor organizations to understand, okay, how does this affect workers? But to know how to plug into this, versus that this is not necessarily a fight. So if we are very aware and clear of the jobs that we each have to do within the system that we exist in, that's how we get a more, I guess, cogent conversation about pathways forward. Because in the end, we're trying to do things that we've never done before. And the only way you do that is to be confident in your skill set and the ability to do your job in an effective manner. And I think ultimately the 2+ years that went into planning, interacting, and communicating about that ultimately got us there by a slim margin.
Thank you so much. And I hope I can get you down to Atlanta sometime. We'll go for a good walk around town and share notes, but you're an inspiration. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you guys for paying attention. I can't wait to get down to that belt line, right?
All right. The invitation's open. I'll follow up with you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Councilman Winston.